A millionaire feared for his ruthless coldness terrifies every employee in his company. When a cleaning lady brings her 5-year-old daughter to work, everyone dreads the worst. After receiving heartbreaking news that makes him cry for the first time in decades, the innocent little girl walks up and whispers, "Sir, may I give you a hug?" As her mother watches in fear, what he does next shocks the entire office. The world, 40 stories below, was a silent diorama under Arthur Vance's control. From inside his glass-walled office, which occupied nearly half the floor, he watched the incessant flow of yellow cabs and black cars, mere pinpricks of light moving in asphalt veins. It was a bleak Monday morning, and the grey autumn sky seemed an extension of the polished marble that clad every surface of his empire. Here, at the pinnacle of Vance Enterprises, silence wasn't an absence of sound. It was a palpable presence, a weapon he wielded with a surgeon's precision. His 200 employees had learned their lesson. The hallways echoed only with the soft click of expensive shoes in moments of dire necessity. Conversations were guilty whispers, exchanged behind closed doors. The loudest permissible sound was the metallic hum of the elevator, announcing the arrival of yet another soul brave enough to face the day. Everyone knew that eye contact with Mr. Vance was an invitation to disaster, an opening for the cutting critique that could dismantle a career in seconds. He was a fortress of ice, and no one dared to try and scale it. His attention was diverted from the urban ballet below by a reflection in the glass. Peterson, his head of human resources, stood in his office doorway, pale as the marble at his feet. The man held a tablet with trembling hands, his body rigid with dread. Arthur didn't turn around. He continued to gaze at the city, forcing Peterson to address his back, one of his many power games. "Mr. Vance," Peterson's voice came out thin, almost a thread. "Forgive me for interrupting. We have a delicate situation." Arthur remained motionless, and the silence stretched for 10 long seconds, each one weighing a ton on the manager's shoulders. Finally, Arthur spoke, his voice low and icy, without moving an inch. "Delicate situations cost money, Peterson, and you know how I feel about losing money." Another silence. Peterson swallowed hard, the sound audible in the office's quiet. "It's about the new cleaning staff member, sir. Elena. She started last week. Her record is impeccable, but her last-minute babysitter fell ill. She has no one to leave her daughter with." Arthur finally swiveled his black leather chair, slowly. His eyes, a blue so pale they seemed like chips of ice, fixed on Peterson. The manager visibly flinched. "And how is that my problem?" The question was rhetorical, a sharp blade. "She's pleading, sir, says the girl is 5 years old, quiet, and won't cause trouble. She just needs the job. She's desperate." The word desperate hung in the air, a scent Arthur detested. Desperation was weakness, and weakness was contagious. His automatic response, a resonant and final no, was already forming on his lips. A child in this sanctuary of order and control. The absurdity of the idea was almost comical. Noise, mess, distractions. It was unthinkable. He opened his mouth to fire not only the woman, but also Peterson for his audacity. But then something unexpected happened. His eyes drifted to the tablet Peterson held, displaying the employee's file. Next to Eleanor's name, there was a small photo attached to the child's file. Leah, a girl with large, dark eyes, with a timid smile that seemed completely out of place in that sterile environment, 5 years old. The age echoed in a forgotten corner of his mind, a distant bell he hadn't heard in decades. For a fraction of a second, the armor of ice around his heart suffered a microscopic fissure. He didn't understand why, but a strange emotion, neither anger nor contempt, invaded him. It was something uncomfortable, an unwanted warmth. He crushed it instantly. With an abrupt nod, he made his decision, one that defied all his logic. One chance. Peterson, she can bring her. But if I hear a single sound, if I see a single toy out of place, if she distracts me for a single second, her mother will be on the street before she can grab her coat, and you'll go with her. Understood? Peterson, shocked by the permission, merely nodded vigorously, muttering thanks as he retreated from the room, as if fleeing a caged beast. Alone again, Arthur turned to the window. What had he done? He, the architect of silence, had just allowed chaos in its purest form to enter his domain. A feeling of deep foreboding enveloped him, as cold as the glass under his fingers. He didn't know why, but he felt that the silence he so cherished was about to be broken forever. Elena and Leah's arrival was a seismic event, disguised as a whisper. They emerged from the service elevator and entered the 40th floor, as if stepping into a cold, silent cathedral. Elena clutched her daughter's hand with a grip that betrayed her panic, her wide eyes scanning the vast white marble corridors and glass walls. Every employee who passed them averted their gaze, not out of rudeness, but from an instinctive fear of being associated with this anomaly. A child, in her blue velvet dress and white shoes that seemed poised to let out a forbidden squeak, was a foreign body in that perfectly sterile corporate organism. Elena pulled her cleaning cart, the gentle roll of its wheels sounding like thunder in her mind. "Leah, my love," she whispered, her voice tense. "Remember what we talked about. Stay very close to Mommy, like a secret, okay? No noise." The girl just nodded, her dark eyes absorbing everything with solemn curiosity, her thumb planted firmly in her mouth. From his glass throne, Arthur observed the scene with calculated disdain. He forced himself to feel the irritation that should have been natural. He watched the woman move with exaggerated subservience, cleaning surfaces that already gleamed, the fear evident in every contained gesture. The child was a small shadow glued to her mother's skirt. He waited for a slip-up, a cry, a shout, anything that would justify the fury he wanted to feel, that would prove his momentary decision had been a colossal mistake. But the girl remained silent, a small specter of innocence in his domain of power. He tried to focus on the reports on his screen, but his eyes were magnetically drawn to the pair. It was like watching a ticking time bomb, and the tension, instead of annoying him, left him strangely alert. He felt like a spectator in a drama he himself had written, and he didn't like the feeling of not controlling the next act. Elena was polishing the long, brushed steel railing of the main staircase when a lock of Leah's hair fell across her eyes. Instinctively, she stopped. With a tender gesture, using the corner of her clean cleaning cloth, she swept the hair from her daughter's face and adjusted the collar of her dress. She smiled at Leah, a quick smile full of love, but also anxiety. "My princess," she murmured. So softly, it was barely a breath. Leah smiled back, her thumb leaving her mouth for an instant. It was a tiny, mundane moment, invisible to almost everyone, but not to Arthur. The overhead light shone on the scene, framing mother and daughter for a fraction of a second, and it was enough. The image pierced through decades of ice and struck something deep and dormant. Suddenly, the office disappeared. He was no longer on the 40th floor. He was in a living room, bathed in late afternoon sun, the smell of polished wood and fresh coffee in the air. He was a 5-year-old boy, and his father, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh, lifted him into the air. "My champion!" his father's voice echoed, not in his auditory memory, but in his soul. He felt the rough touch of his father's beard on his cheek, and the secure embrace that made him feel like he could touch the ceiling. It was a memory of warmth, of security, of an unquestioning love he had buried so deep he'd forgotten its existence. The memory shattered as quickly as it came, leaving a trail of cold and an inexplicable tightness in his chest. Arthur blinked, the vision of the marble office returning with painful clarity. He felt disoriented, as if he'd been yanked from a good dream into a familiar nightmare. The melancholy that followed was a thick, suffocating fog. It was an old ache, a wound he thought had healed long ago. He turned abruptly to his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but the words on the screen made no sense. That warmth, that feeling of being unconditionally loved. Where and when had he lost it? The question haunted him, unwelcome and corrosive. Irritated with himself, with the woman and the child who had conjured that ghost, he stood up, determined to end it. He walked to the glass, ready to shout, to fire, to restore his cold order. But at looking down, his breath caught in his throat. Elena was at the end of the corridor, her back to him. And there, standing directly in front of his glass door, was the girl, alone. She wasn't making noise. She wasn't touching anything. She was just standing there, her head tilted to the side, looking directly at him with those large, unfathomable eyes, as if she could see through the glass, through the anger, and straight into the wounded child he had just rediscovered within himself. Time seemed to freeze. Arthur Vance's universe, once a Swiss watch of precision and predictability, now came down to that small space between him and the girl on the other side of the glass. Her eyes held no fear, no reverence, just a pure, disarming curiosity he hadn't seen on a human face in over 30 years. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stand up, open the door, and end this charade with the icy fury that was his trademark. But he couldn't move. The image of his father lifting him into the air still shimmered at the edges of his consciousness, a ghost of warmth in a mausoleum of ice. He was paralyzed, a king on his glass throne, suddenly powerless before the least of his subjects. The sound of hurried footsteps and a gasp of panic broke the spell. Eleanor appeared at the turn of the corridor, her face a mask of terror at seeing Leah standing in front of the lion's den. "Leah, my God, get over here now!" she hissed, her voice laden with a panic so profound that Arthur could almost physically feel it. But before Elena could grab her daughter's arm, Leah moved, not towards her mother, but to the side, her pinky finger pointing to the side wall of Arthur's office, a wall he barely noticed, but which was, in fact, a massive, floor-to-ceiling aquarium. It was his only personal luxury, a silent, controlled ecosystem of vibrant corals and exotic fish that moved with indifferent grace. It was the only form of life he tolerated in his proximity, for it demanded nothing from him. "Look, Mommy, fishies!" Leah's voice, though a whisper, rang like a bell in the oppressive quiet. She pressed her palms against the corridor glass, her face lit by the aquarium's blue and purple lights. "That one's blue as my dress." Arthur watched, fascinated against his will. No one had ever commented on his aquarium. It was part of the furniture, an expensive, ignored detail. To see the genuine joy on the girl's face was like witnessing a rare and inexplicable natural phenomenon. Elena, mortified, grabbed Leah's hand. "I'm sorry, sir, so sorry." "She won't bother you again. It's an emperor angelfish." The words came out of Arthur's mouth before he could stop them. His own voice sounded strange to his ears, devoid of its usual steel edge. It was just informative. Elena froze, her jaw dropping. Leah turned her head, her eyes sparkling. "Emperor? Is he a king?" Arthur found himself walking slowly towards his office's glass wall until he was a few feet from the girl, separated only by the transparent partition. "In a sense," he replied, the stiffness in his shoulders decreasing a millimeter. "He's the dominant one in the tank." Leah pointed to a vivid yellow fish with black stripes. "And that one, he looks like a sunbeam." The simplicity of the observation disarmed him. "Butterfly fish," he said, the technical name coming out of pure habit. "They are bright." It was the first time in years he had used such a simple, subjective word to describe something. At that exact moment, Peterson passed by in the corridor. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening at the impossible scene. Arthur Vance, the tyrant, the iceberg, talking through the glass with the cleaning lady's daughter about colorful fish. Peterson's mouth opened and closed like one of the aquarium's inhabitants. He slowly backed away, disappearing from view, but Arthur knew the damage was done. The secret of that bizarre interaction would soon spread like wildfire. The realization didn't enrage him as it should have. Instead, a strange calm enveloped him as he watched Leah. The girl, satisfied with the answers, finally allowed her mother to pull her away. But after a few steps, she stopped and turned. She didn't look at the fish this time. She looked directly at him, her head tilted again, her gaze serious and penetrating. "Mister," she said, her voice clear and firm, piercing the glass as if it didn't exist. "Why are you sad? Your eyes look like they're going to cry." The girl's words hit Arthur with the force of a punch to the gut. "Why are you sad? Your eyes look like they're going to cry." No adult in his professional or personal life would dare to make such an observation. It was an invasion, a direct breach of the impenetrable emotional perimeter he had spent decades building. His first reaction was a wave of icy fury. How dare she, that insignificant creature, projecting feelings onto his face as if he were an open book. He should fire her mother right then and there, make an example that would echo through those marble corridors for years. He opened his mouth to call Peterson, the HR manager's name, a curse on his lips, but the sound didn't come out. Instead, Leah's question echoed in his head, repeating incessantly. Sad. He wasn't sad. He was powerful, controlled, ruthless. Sadness was an indulgence for the weak. But then, why did his chest ache with a dull, familiar pressure? Why did the image of his father haunt him with such vigor? He turned his back to the corridor, refusing to give the child or her terrified mother the satisfaction of seeing his reaction. Elena, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, pulled Leah's hand harder. "Come on, my love. Now." She practically dragged the girl away, disappearing down the corridor. The silence that settled was different from before. It wasn't a silence of order, but a heavy silence, laden with the girl's unanswered question. Arthur walked to his desk and sat down, but couldn't focus. The phrase, "Your eyes look like they're going to cry," was etched in his mind. He stood up and went to the private restroom adjacent to his office, a luxurious room of black marble and steel. He stared at himself in the mirror. His ice-blue eyes stared back, his expression as hard and unyielding as ever, but for the first time, he forced himself to look closer. There were fine lines of weariness at the corners, a shadow, a depth he had always interpreted as authority, but which, under the merciless bathroom light, could be mistaken for an old pain. He wasn't crying, of course. Arthur Vance didn't cry. But the girl's suggestion forced him to see something he had ignored, a vulnerability he thought was perfectly hidden. Throughout the day, the effect of Leah's presence began to spread through the office like a subtle wave. Whispers followed Peterson wherever he went. Is it true he talked to the child? People risked peeking down the corridor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the small anomaly who had apparently humanized the monster. The atmosphere, usually taut as a piano wire, relaxed an imperceptible degree. Two junior analysts exchanged a discreet smile at the water cooler. The head of the marketing department, a man who lived on the verge of a panic attack, was seen squaring his shoulders. Arthur's reputation, the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, was being eroded by a 5-year-old girl and her observation about fish. In the afternoon, he received a call on his direct line. It was from Marcus Thorne, one of the company's major investors, a man as ruthless as Arthur, but without his subtlety. "Arthur, what's this story I'm hearing?" Thorne's voice sounded oily and concerned. "Rumors that you're distracted, that you're allowing civilians to roam the executive floor. My contacts say the vibe there is weird. Don't tell me you're getting soft in your old age." Arthur gripped the phone tightly, his anger finally finding a suitable target. "My methods are not up for discussion, Marcus. Last quarter's profits speak for themselves." Profits are about the future, Arthur, and the future depends on your reputation for being an unyielding bastard. Don't lose sight of that." The call ended, leaving a bitter taste in Arthur's mouth. Thorne was right. His image was his capital, and it was being threatened from within. He needed to reassert his control, crush that nascent sentimentalism before it bloomed. Determined, he stood up, ready to go to where Elena was working and finish what he had started. He would end this distraction once and for all. But as he passed his office's glass wall again, his gaze fell on a small object on the corridor floor, right where Leah had been standing. It was a tiny ladybug hair clip, fallen and forgotten. He stopped, looking at the small spot of color on the monochromatic floor. It was such an insignificant object, so out of place, and yet it seemed to hold immense weight. He found himself imagining the girl's small fingers trying to fasten it in her hair that morning, a simple gesture, full of life, a gesture that didn't exist in his world. He reached for the doorknob, conflict stirring within him. Reason told him to crush this invasion, but something else, something old and forgotten, urged him to open the door, pick up the small ladybug, and what? He didn't know. And that uncertainty was the most terrifying feeling of all. Arthur's hand hovered over the cold steel doorknob, a bridge between two worlds. The world of absolute control he knew, and the unknown, chaotic territory the small ladybug hair clip represented. Logic, sharp as a blade, screamed at him to ignore the object, call security, have the corridor cleaned, and erase any trace of that intrusion. But the image of Leah's serious eyes, questioning his sadness, held him captive. He was not a man of impulses, but in that moment one overcame him. Slowly, he turned the knob. The soft click of the lock echoed in the silent corridor, a sound of capitulation. He opened the door, stepped out of his sanctuary, and crouched down. The movement was strange, awkward. His knees protested, unaccustomed to such an act of humility. With fingers that signed multi-million-dollar checks, he picked up the small plastic clip. It was light, almost insignificant in his hand, but the warmth that seemed to emanate from it was real and disconcerting. He stood up, the ladybug hidden in his closed palm, and began to walk down the corridor with no clear destination, just following the faint, rhythmic sound of a mop on the floor. He found Elena and Leah at the end of a less busy wing, near the archives. Elena was cleaning the floor with quick, efficient movements, her face still tense. Leah was sitting on a small plastic stool her mother had brought, drawing in a notebook with a red crayon. She was completely absorbed, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that it seemed surreal in that corporate environment. Arthur stopped a few feet away, watching them. Elena didn't notice him, her back to him. Leah, however, sensed his presence. She looked up, and her eyes met his. This time, there was no surprise, just a silent recognition. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Arthur took a step forward. "Miss," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. Elena spun around with a start, the mop falling from her hands with a dull thud. Her eyes widened in terror, and she instinctively placed herself in front of Leah like a lioness protecting her cub. "Mr. Vance, I'm sorry, we're almost done here. We won't bother you." "You dropped this!" Arthur interrupted her, opening his hand. The small red and black ladybug rested in his palm, a vibrant speck of color against his pale skin. Elena looked from the clip to his face, confusion and fear battling in her features. She couldn't process the image, the most feared man in the city, offering her daughter's hair clip. Leah peeked from behind her mother. "My ladybug!" she exclaimed, a smile finally breaking across her face. She scurried from under Elena's protective arm, walked to Arthur, and, with surprising delicacy, took the clip from his hand. Her small fingers brushed his skin for an instant, A touch as light as a butterfly's wing, but one that sent a shockwave up Arthur's arm. "Thank you, mister," Leah said, her voice serious again. "It gets lost all the time." He merely nodded, unable to formulate a response. Elena watched, her mouth slightly agape, panic giving way to mute astonishment. She seemed to be witnessing a miracle or a hallucination. "We should go," she murmured, gently pulling Leah back. "Thank you very much, sir." They moved away, and Arthur stood in the middle of the corridor, his palm still tingling where the girl's fingers had touched him. He felt a strange emptiness where the clip had been. He returned to his office and closed the door, the click concluding the episode. But something had changed. The office seemed larger, emptier, the silence deeper and less comforting. He looked at the city outside but saw no power or control. He saw only a million small lives, full of lost ladybugs, crayon drawings, and gentle touches. He felt as if a door had opened in his soul, a door he hadn't even known existed, and a cold, lonely draft was blowing through it. That night, for the first time in many years, Arthur Vance had difficulty sleeping, haunted by the ghost of a touch and the growing certainty that the wall he built to keep the world out had also trapped him within. The week progressed at a strangely altered pace. Leah's presence, though confined to whispers and discreet movements, acted as a chemical catalyst in Vance Enterprises' sterile environment. Arthur's interactions with the girl were rare and brief, a nod in the corridor, a glance exchanged through the aquarium glass, but each sent ripples throughout the floor. Employees, previously terrified, now observed their boss with a mixture of fear and fascination. They began to call Leah, in whispers, the charm. It seemed that as long as the girl was present, the lion's fury remained dormant. Productivity, surprisingly, increased. Paralytic fear was replaced by cautious curiosity, and people worked with renewed energy, as if the air was lighter, more breathable. Arthur was aware of all this. He saw the glances, felt the shift in atmosphere, and it infuriated and intrigued him in equal measure. He was losing control. His authority based on fear was unraveling, but in its place, something more efficient seemed to be growing. On Friday, he was reviewing weekly reports when an unusual sound penetrated his fortress of silence. It was a soft, melodic, almost imperceptible sound. A lullaby. He frowned, raising his head. The sound came from the corridor. He stood up and walked to the door, irritation growing. He opened it a crack and looked out. At the end of the corridor, in a small nook near the break room, Elena was cleaning the cabinets. Leah was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, her eyes heavy with sleep. And Elena was singing to her. It was a simple melody in Spanish, a lullaby her own mother had probably sung to her. Elena's voice was low, sweet, and full of a love so palpable it seemed to warm the cold corridor air. Arthur stood paralyzed, listening. The melody was unfamiliar, but the emotion was universal. It was the sound of comfort, of security, of home. It was everything his world of marble and glass was not. Suddenly, he was transported again, this time not to a memory of his father, but to a darker, hazier one. He was in a dark room, alone. He could hear muffled, angry voices from beyond the door. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was cutting, full of pain and resentment. It was his parents, arguing. The argument stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut. And then, silence. A deep, heavy silence that lasted all night. The next morning, his father was gone. Forever. His mother never sang to him again. The music was replaced by a tense silence. A sadness that hung over the house like a dust cloud that never settled. It was there, in that silence, that little Arthur began to build his wall, brick by brick, learning that emotions led to pain and that control was the only defense. Elena's lullaby ended. Arthur blinked, back in the present, his heart pounding in his chest with the pain of that old wound reopened. He saw Elena pick up her sleeping daughter in her arms, her face full of a tenderness that struck him like a physical blow. He retreated into his office and closed the door, his hand trembling. He felt exposed, vulnerable. That woman and her daughter were, unknowingly, demolishing his defenses one by one. He needed to stop this. This experiment had gone too far. Thorne's call, the employees' whispers, and now that avalanche of painful memories. It was too much. He picked up the phone to call Peterson. The decision was made. Elena and the child would have to go. Order and silence would be restored. But as his finger hovered over the call button, the phone on his desk rang. His private doctor's direct line. It was a call he didn't expect. He answered, his voice cold and controlled as always. Dr. Evans. Arthur. The doctor's voice sounded grave, devoid of his usual cordiality. I've received the results of your routine tests. I need you to come to my office. Today. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. I can't. I'm busy. Arthur, cancel what you're doing. This can't wait. There was an urgency in the doctor's voice that Arthur had never heard before. An urgency that made the ground beneath his feet suddenly feel less solid. Dr. Evans' office was the opposite of Arthur's. While Arthur's world was made of right angles, glass and steel, the doctor's was warm wood, soft leather armchairs, and books. It was a place designed to soothe, but at that moment, every detail seemed to mock the turbulence raging within him. Arthur sat stiffly in the chair opposite the mahogany desk, his hands resting on his knees, the epitome of control. But inside, his heart beat with an uncontrolled urgency, a wild drum against his ribs. Dr. Evans, a grey-haired man with a kind gaze who had known him for 20 years, avoided his eyes. He shuffled some papers, adjusted his glasses. Gestures Arthur immediately recognized as delaying tactics. Fear, an emotion he despised and rarely felt, began to seep into his veins like an icy venom. Just say it, Robert. Arthur's voice came out harsher than he intended. Dr. Evans sighed, finally raising his eyes. The compassion in them was almost unbearable. Arthur, the results of your echocardiogram and blood tests show something we cannot ignore. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You have a condition called idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy. In layman's terms, your heart muscle is weakened and enlarged. It's not pumping blood as efficiently as it should. Arthur processed the information clinically, as he would a business report. Weakened muscle, inefficient. These were terms he used to describe failing companies, not his own body. What's the prognosis? He asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Dr. Evans hesitated. It's serious. The disease's progression varies, but in your case, it appears to be at an advanced stage. With medication and drastic lifestyle changes, we can manage symptoms, improve your quality of life. But we need to be realistic. I don't pay you to be vague, Robert. Be realistic. How long? The question hung in the air, brutal and naked. The doctor leaned back in his chair, his face aging before Arthur's eyes. Without a heart transplant, which is a long and uncertain process, the life expectancy for someone with your condition at this stage is 1 to 2 years, perhaps less. 1 to 2 years. The words made no sense. They were like a foreign language. He, Arthur Vance, the man who planned his acquisitions 5-10 years in advance, now had his future measured in months. The world around him seemed to tilt. The books on the shelf distorted. The soft ticking of a grandfather clock on the wall sounded like hammering in his skull, each second a countdown to the end. He saw himself back in his office, looking at the city below. His city, his empire, all of it, built with decades of sacrifice, of self-imposed solitude, of a coldness that froze any relationship. For what? To leave it all behind in a matter of months. The irony was so cruel, so overwhelming, that a strange sound escaped his throat. a sound that began as a choke and transformed into a dry, bitter laugh. He stood up, the chair scraping noisily on the Persian rug. "Thank you, Robert," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. He walked to the door, his body moving purely by instinct, his mind a whirlwind of denial and panic. "Arthur, wait," Dr. Evans said, standing up. "We need to discuss treatment, next steps." But Arthur was already in the corridor, moving quickly, ignoring the receptionist's curious glances. He entered the elevator, pressed the ground floor button, and leaned against the cold metal wall as the world rose around him. He didn't go back to the office. He couldn't. Instead, he began to walk, aimlessly, through the streets of a city that suddenly seemed strange and hostile. The sounds, the people, the lights, everything was an assault on his senses. He, who controlled everything from the top of his tower, was now lost in the crowd, just another anonymous face walking towards oblivion. Hours later, as the sky began to darken, he found himself, by a twist of fate or a subconscious instinct, in front of his own building. He took the elevator, but not to his penthouse apartment. He pressed the button for the 40th floor. The office was dark and silent. The night cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet. He walked to his office, the only light coming from the ghostly glow of the city outside, and then he saw her, a small figure sitting on the floor in front of the aquarium, illuminated only by the tank's blue lights. Leah, alone. What was she doing here? Where was her mother? Before he could process the scene, the girl turned. Her eyes, large and dark in the gloom, fixed on him, and in them he saw no curiosity or fear. He saw something that broke him. He saw a reflection of his own terrified loneliness. The silence in the darkened office was so profound, Arthur could hear the soft hum of the aquarium filters and the frantic beat of his own condemned heart. The sight of Leah, small and solitary in the immensity of his empire, dealt a final blow to his facade of control. Dr. Evans' news had cracked his armor. The inexplicable presence of that child was shattering it. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out as a harsh whisper, a strange sound in the quiet. "Where's your mother?" Leah didn't answer immediately. She just watched him, her head tilted as if evaluating something. Then she pointed to the aquarium. "I'm counting the stars," she said, her voice small but clear. "Mommy says the white dots on the black fish are like stars in the night sky." Arthur looked at the dominoed damselfish, their dark bodies speckled with white, and for the first time, he saw what the girl saw. They weren't biological specimens. They were miniature constellations, swimming in a private galaxy. The poetry of the observation, coming from a 5-year-old, was so unexpected, so pure, that it left him speechless. "My mommy's in the break room," Leah continued, answering his previous question. "She's not feeling well. Her head hurts." A pang of irritation, a reflex of his old self, surfaced. A sick employee, a child left unsupervised. It was a breach of protocol. But the irritation died before it even formed, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. He no longer had energy for anger. "You shouldn't be here alone," he managed to say, the words sounding empty and useless. Leah shrugged, a gesture so childlike it hurt. "I'm not alone," she said, looking directly at him. "You're here." The simplicity of the statement struck him. In his world, people were with him out of fear, out of greed, out of obligation. No one ever simply was with him. The solitude that had enveloped him like a shroud for decades suddenly seemed unbearably heavy. The reality of his diagnosis crashed down on him with full force. 1 to 2 years. He was going to die, alone, as he had always lived. The realization was so brutal, so visceral, that his legs gave way. He leaned against his office's glass wall, the coldness of the material penetrating his expensive suit. He slid down the wall to sit on the marble floor, the sound of his body falling echoing softly in the cavernous space. He lowered his head into his hands, not to hide tears. He didn't cry, but to try and contain the world that was spinning out of control. The empire, the billions, the reputation, everything dissolved into a haze of insignificance. All that remained was a man sitting on the dark floor of his office, confronting the emptiness of his own life. And then he felt it, a small movement near him, the rustle of a dress. He raised his head and saw Leah standing a few inches away. Her large, dark eyes were filled with a solemn concern, an empathy he didn't deserve. She extended her small hand and touched his knee. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice soft as velvet. He couldn't answer. A knot formed in his throat, a knot of pain, regret, and a fear so deep it choked him. He just shook his head, an almost imperceptible movement. The girl watched his face for a long moment, as if reading a sad story. And then she did the unthinkable. She moved closer, wrapped her small arms around his neck, and hugged him. "Mommy says hugs make the pain go away," she whispered in his ear, her breath warm and sweet against his skin. The shock of the physical contact, so unexpected and so genuine, broke the last dam within him. For the first time in over 40 years, since the day his father left, Arthur Vance cried. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs, but silent, warm tears that streamed down his face and were lost in his shirt collar. A deluge of pain for a life lived in the shadow of power and the absence of love. And in that child's arms, he was not a millionaire. He was just a man, broken and afraid, receiving a comfort he never knew he desperately needed. Time seemed to dissolve in that embrace. For Arthur, it could have been seconds or hours. The outside world, with its fatal diagnoses and crumbling empires, vanished, replaced by the overwhelming sensation of Leah's small arms around his neck and the sound of his own broken heart finally breaking free. The tears he shed were not just for the time he had left, but for all the time he had lost. For every human connection he had rejected, every outstretched hand he had pushed away. He cried for the lonely child he had been and the empty man he had become. The sound of a muffled cry and quick footsteps tore them from that momentary sanctuary. Elena appeared at the office entrance, her face pale with horror, her eyes wide at seeing her daughter embracing the most feared man in the city, who in turn was visibly shaken. Her panic was a force of nature, impure and primal. "Leah, let go of him." "Oh my God, Mr. Vance, I'm so sorry. I don't know what got into her. I just closed my eyes for a minute. I swear, please don't." She rushed forward, ready to pull her daughter away, words tumbling out in a desperate plea to save her job, her security, her life. Arthur raised a hand, a gesture that would normally silence an entire boardroom. But this time, there was no power in it, just a trembling vulnerability. "It's all right," he managed to say, his voice hoarse and unrecognizable. Leah, sensing the shift in tension, slowly pulled away, but kept her small hand on his arm as if to anchor him. She looked at her mother, then back at Arthur, a small bridge between two worlds of fear and pain. Elena froze, the scene before her defying all logic. The man who humiliated executives for sport was sitting on the floor, his eyes red, allowing her daughter to touch him. The incongruity was so shocking that her own fear wavered, replaced by stunned confusion. She saw the wet stain on his shirt collar, noticed the devastation on his face, and the narrative she had built about him. The monster, the tyrant, began to crumble. "Sir, are you okay?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, genuine concern overriding her fear. The simple question, coming from a woman who had every reason to fear him, was almost as disarming as Leah's hug. He looked at Elena, truly saw her for the first time, not as the cleaning lady, but as a woman, a mother, someone who understood pain and concern. In her eyes, he saw no judgment, only cautious compassion. And it was the expression in her eyes that made him realize something terrible. Her fear wasn't just about losing her job. It was deeper, darker. It was a fear that came from a place where losing a job didn't just mean financial hardship, but a return to real, immediate danger. He didn't know how he knew, but the certainty hit him with cold clarity. That woman was running from something, or someone. The job at Vance Enterprises wasn't just a livelihood, it was a sanctuary. And he, in his arrogant ignorance, had almost taken it from her. No, he answered honestly to her question. I'm not okay. The confession, the first he had made to another human being in decades, hung in the air, laden with immense weight. He stood up slowly, feeling old and fragile. He looked from Elena, with her deep and silent fear, to Leah, with her innocent wisdom, and then to his own reflection in the dark glass. 3 wounded souls, brought together by chance at the top of a tower of solitude. Go home, he told Eleanor, his voice firmer now. Take your daughter. Take the rest of the week off, with pay. Elena stared at him, shocked. But sir, the work can wait. He cut her off, but without his usual impatience. Just go. She hesitated, then nodded, still looking disoriented. She took Leah's hand and began to walk away. Before disappearing down the corridor, Leah turned and looked at him. Will you get better? She asked. Arthur looked at the small figure who had broken his defenses with a simple hug. I don't know, he replied, the honesty exhausting him, but I'll try. Alone again, Arthur walked to his desk. The order and control he so cherished had vanished. In their place, there was a mess of emotions, fears, and an unexpected, terrifying connection to 2 strangers. He looked at the papers on his desk, reports, projections, contracts. Everything seemed ridiculous, meaningless. And then he saw. In his haste to leave for the doctor's office, he had left Dr. Evans' confidential report face up, right in the center of his mahogany desk. The word cardiomyopathy was in stark capital letters, visible to anyone who looked. And his office door was still open. Arthur's blood ran cold. The document, with its cruel diagnosis in stark capital letters, was exposed like an open wound in the heart of his empire. The wide-open door was a silent invitation for his most devastating secret to be discovered. Who could have passed by? Peterson, some ambitious executive working late. The security team, the possibility of his vulnerability being revealed not just emotionally but clinically, filled him with a cold, calculating panic, a feeling far more familiar than the pain he'd felt moments before. This was ground he knew. Damage control. He quickly tucked the report into a locked drawer and reviewed the corridor's security camera footage on his computer. The footage showed Eleanor and Leah, his own arrival, and, yes, there it was. Peterson, doing one last round before heading home, stopped in front of Arthur's open door. He looked inside for an instant, his face a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. His eyes fixed on the desk for no more than 3 seconds before he recoiled and went on his way. 3 seconds. Would it have been enough? Arthur knew it would. Peterson was meticulous, observant. He would have seen. The certainty hit him with the weight of an anvil. His death sentence was now, potentially, public knowledge, or at least corporate knowledge. The news would spread like a virus, faster and more lethal than the disease itself. Investors, led by men like Thorne, would devour him alive. They would see not a sick man, but a depreciating asset, an instability that threatened their profits. His position, his legacy, everything he had sacrificed his life for, was about to crumble. Throughout the weekend, Arthur barricaded himself in his penthouse apartment, silence being his only companion. But, for the first time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was a vacuum that amplified his fears. He ignored calls from Dr. Evans and his board. The outside world ceased to exist. He found himself thinking not about market strategies or corporate defenses, but about the touch of Leah's hand and Elena's frightened eyes. The connection he felt with them, so raw and real, contrasted violently with the transactional nature of all other relationships in his life. He realized that if he died tomorrow, he would be remembered as a force, a titan, a tyrant. But no one would miss him. No one would cry for Arthur, the man. On Monday, he returned to the office with a new, grim determination. He expected an atmosphere of crisis, veiled whispers, looks of pity or opportunism. Instead, he found something far more disconcerting: normalcy. Everyone greeted him with the same reverent fear as always. Peterson handed him the morning report with steady hands. Nothing. It was as if the ticking time bomb he expected to have exploded simply didn't exist. The uncertainty was torture. The wave of corporate upheaval he foresaw hadn't materialized. Were they all pretending? Or had Peterson, for some unfathomable reason, kept the information to himself? Mid-morning, his secretary announced an unexpected visitor. Elena was outside his office, holding a small plastic container. She wasn't in her cleaning uniform. She wore a simple but tidy dress. "Mr. Vance," his secretary said over the intercom, her voice confused. "She insists she needs to speak with you, says it's personal." Arthur, intrigued, allowed her in. Elena entered, her nervousness evident in her hands clutching the container. "Sir, I apologize for disturbing you. I wanted to thank you for the days off, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." She extended the container. "I made soup. My grandmother used to say chicken soup cures everything, even sadness." Arthur looked at the soup, then at Elena's sincere face. The gesture was so simple, so genuinely kind, that it left him speechless. No one had ever offered him something that didn't come with a price or a hidden agenda. "And Leah," Elena continued, "she made this for you." She took a folded paper from her pocket. It was the drawing Leah had been making on Friday night. He unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing of the aquarium. Colorful fish swam in a blue sea, and in the corner there were two stick figures, one large and one small, holding hands. Above them, Leah had drawn a big, smiling yellow sun. Arthur looked at the drawing, at the raw, childlike representation of a connection, and felt something break within him. Decades of isolation, of mistrust, of a loneliness he mistook for strength. Everything suddenly seemed futile. That soup and that drawing meant more to him at that moment than his entire financial empire. He looked up at Elena, and for the first time, he didn't see an employee, but an equal. A person who, despite her own fears and difficulties, found space in her heart to worry about him. "Elena," he began, his voice choked, "there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to be completely honest. What are you running from?" The question hit her like a wave. Color drained from her face, and the fear he had seen on Friday returned with full force. Her eyes welled with tears, and she recoiled as if ready to bolt. Arthur's question hung in the air, undoing the fragile peace the soup and drawing had created. Elena's face transformed, gratitude and concern swept away by a wave of pure, icy panic. She recoiled, her body instinctively shrinking like a cornered animal. Her eyes, which moments before offered compassion, were now mirrors of an ancient terror. The tears that welled were not of gratitude, but of fear. The reaction was so violent, so visceral, that it confirmed Arthur's suspicion in a way no words could. He immediately regretted the bluntness of his question. The old Arthur would have used that vulnerability as a weapon. The new Arthur felt an overwhelming need to disarm her. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, his voice soft, devoid of any authority. "Elena, please, you're safe here. Sit down." He indicated the leather chair in front of his desk, a place even his vice presidents occupied with trepidation. She hesitated, her body trembling, her gaze darting to the door, calculating her escape route. But then her eyes met his. And she saw the same vulnerability she had seen on Friday. There was no trap in his gaze, only a quiet, weary concern. He wasn't a predator about to strike. He was a wounded man offering shelter to another wounded being. Slowly, as if her limbs were made of glass, she sat on the edge of the chair, the soup container forgotten in her lap. "My ex-partner," she whispered, her voice so frail he had to lean in to hear. Leah's father. Marco, saying the name aloud seemed to steal her breath. He won't leave us alone. When I left him, he said if I couldn't be his, I wouldn't be anyone else's, and that he'd never let me have Leah all to myself. Her words painted a grim picture of possessiveness and threat. He was charming at first, she continued, her eyes fixed on a distant spot on the wall. But his love became a cage. He controlled everything. My money, my friends, where I went. When Leah was born, it got worse. He saw her as just another possession. I realized I had to leave, not for myself, but for her, so she wouldn't grow up thinking that was love. She paused, swallowing hard. I fled in the middle of the night with what little I could carry. I moved cities. I got restraining orders, but they're just paper. He always finds me. This job, I thought here, in a place so big, so impersonal, we'd be safe. Anonymous. Arthur listened in silence. Every word from Elena resonating with his own imprisonment. He was trapped by his illness, she by her past. Both lived with a death sentence hanging over their heads. His, literal, hers, a constant threat of violence. The realization hit him with crystal clarity. The protection he could offer was far more than a salary. It was security. "You're not anonymous anymore, Elena," he said, his voice grave. "But you are not unprotected." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city he commanded. "As of today, you no longer work for the cleaning company. You work for me, directly, as my personal assistant. Your office will be right here, next to mine. Your salary will be triple, and Leah can stay with you. There's an adjacent room we can turn into a play space for her. Here, on this floor, no one enters without my personal authorization code. You will be safe." Elena stared at him, mouth agape, the tears of fear now transforming into tears of disbelief and relief. "Sir, I can't. I'm not qualified." "I decide who's qualified," he interrupted her gently. "You are loyal, you are brave, and you brought me soup when I needed it most. Those are the only qualifications that matter to me right now." A sob of relief escaped Elena. For the first time in years, a glimpse of a future without fear seemed possible. "Thank you," she whispered, the word laden with a weight of gratitude that deeply moved him. "Let me just call my sister. Tell her the good news." She reached for her cell phone in her purse, the first genuine smile lighting up her face. But as the screen lit up, her smile froze. There was a single text message from an unknown number, received just minutes ago. Her heart pounding, she opened it. The message contained only 6 words, words that transformed her sanctuary into a trap. "I like our daughter's blue dress." The cell phone slipped from her trembling hand and fell to the carpet with a dull thud. He was here. He had seen them. Elena's world shattered with the dull thud of the phone on the carpet. The air left her lungs, and a paralyzing cold gripped her limbs. The message was a verbal grenade, exploding years of precariously built peace. He was here. He had found them. The sanctuary Arthur had just offered transformed, in the blink of an eye, into the most visible of cages. Arthur reacted with a speed that belied his condition. The businessman gave way to the protector. In an instant, he was by her side, his face a mask of controlled fury. He didn't need to ask. The expression on her face said everything. "Security," he growled into the intercom, his voice a low thunder. "Lock down the building. No one in, no one out, without my personal authorization code. Sweep the perimeter, now." He crouched in front of Eleanor, taking her cold hands. "You are safe. He won't get up here." But, as the words of comfort left his mouth, The phone on his desk rang, the board line. The second front of the war had just opened. He answered, keeping his eyes on Elena. It was Marcus Thorne, and he wasn't alone. The voice of a lawyer, cold and precise, took the line. "Arthur, we are aware of your health condition." Peterson felt it was his fiduciary duty to inform the board. The betrayal was a physical blow. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "your recent association with a subordinate employee and her daughter, which has become a subject of gossip in the business press, raises serious questions about your judgment. The board has called an emergency meeting to discuss your removal from the presidency for incapacity and emotional instability." Incapacity, instability. The words were daggers, designed to cut deep. They were using his newfound humanity, the very connection that was saving him, as the weapon to destroy him. In the midst of that double assault, the physical threat on the ground floor and the corporate ambush at the top, his body betrayed him. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, like an iron band tightening around his heart. The air grew thin. He leaned on the desk, his breath caught, the world tilting dangerously. Elena, seeing his anguish, stood up, her own fear forgotten for a moment. "Mr. Vance, what is it?" He raised a hand, trying to signal he would be okay. But the pain was a cruel reminder of his mortality. He was fighting a war on three fronts, against a monster from the past, against the sharks he himself had created, and against the rebellion of his own body. The lawyer continued, his voice relentless. "We suggest you step aside discreetly, Arthur. If you fight this, we'll use everything. Your condition, your erratic behavior, will make it look like a sick, sentimental old man is sinking the company on a whim. Your reputation will be destroyed." The choice was clear and brutal. Hide, retreat, protect what remained of his legacy and perhaps his health, which would mean abandoning Elena and Leah to their fate, or fight. Fighting would mean exposing everything, his illness, his relationship with them, making them an even bigger target for the media and, consequently, for Marco. The intercom buzzed again, the head of security's voice, urgent. "Mr. Vance, we have a situation in the lobby. It's the man, Marco. He's yelling Elena's name, causing a scene. The press is out here. Looks like he called them. He's giving an interview, posing as a desperate father whose family was stolen from him. The culmination, the convergence of all his nightmares. The enemy was at the gates, twisting truth into lies for the world to see. The traitors were in the castle, sharpening their knives, and his own heart was failing." Arthur looked at Elena, her face bathed in silent tears of pure terror. He looked through the open door into the adjacent room, where Leah's drawing of the smiling sun still lay on the table, his empire, his life, his new family, everything hanging in the balance. A deathly silence fell over the office, broken only by his ragged breath. Then, with a clarity he hadn't felt in years, he knew what to do. He straightened up, ignoring the pain in his chest, a cold calm descending upon him. He picked up the phone. "Security," he said, his voice firm, resonating with an authority that came not from power, but from purpose. "Do not detain him. Tell him I'm coming down." The descent in the glass elevator was the longest of Arthur's life. With each floor that passed, he saw the chaos in the lobby approaching, a media circus in full swing. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters jostled, and at the center of it all, Marco. He was exactly as Elena had described him, charming in a predatory way, staging a heartbroken father's performance for the cameras, crocodile tears streaming down his face. Beside Arthur, Elena trembled uncontrollably, her face devoid of color. "Don't do this," she whispered, her voice broken. "He's dangerous. He'll hurt you." Arthur placed his hand over hers, a firm, reassuring gesture. "Darkness only has power when we hide from it," he said, his voice calm. the pain in his chest, a closely guarded secret. Today, we shed light. The elevator doors opened and a shocked silence fell over the lobby as Arthur Vance, the reclusive titan, emerged. Camera flashes intensified. Reporters shouted questions. Arthur ignored them, his eyes fixed on Marco. Marco, caught off guard, faltered in his performance. Anger flashed in his eyes before he could hide it again under the victim's mask. "There he is," Marco yelled to the cameras. "The millionaire who stole my family, who's holding my daughter and her mother hostage with his money." Arthur walked slowly until he stopped a few feet from him, with the calm of a predator at the top of the food chain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your family," Arthur said, his voice clear and cutting, silencing the crowd. "It's interesting that you use that word." He turned slightly, addressing not Marco, but the cameras, the world. "This man talks about love. But what does he really want?" Arthur reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. In front of everyone, he began to write, "Do you want your daughter back? Or do you want to be compensated for your loss?" Marco stared at him, confused, the trap closing in around him. Arthur finished writing and tore off the check. He held it out. $10 million, Arthur announced, his voice resonating in the silence. "Signed, right now. In exchange, you disappear. You sign a document relinquishing all parental rights and never approach Elena or Leah again. If you truly love them, my money will mean nothing. You will refuse." The lobby held its breath. It was a public checkmate. Marco's greed fought against his facade. His eyes flashed to the check, the number with all those zeros. For an instant, the world saw the true man behind the mask. The heartbroken father disappeared, replaced by a petty opportunist. He reached out a trembling hand for the check, and in that moment, he lost everything. The flashes exploded. The reporters understood the story. It wasn't a rescue, it was a transaction. Marco's mask disintegrated under the weight of his own greed. "He's not worth a penny," Arthur said, tearing the check in two. Security, two guards who had been waiting for the signal, grabbed Marco by the arms. He struggled, shouting obscenities, the veneer of civility completely destroyed. As he was dragged away, the truth of his character was exposed for all to see. Arthur turned and walked back to Elena, who looked at him with a mixture of awe and overwhelming relief. The pain in his chest was now a fire, but he ignored it. In the middle of the lobby, he took her hand. "It's over," he said softly. "He can no longer hide behind lies." At that moment, his phone vibrated. A text message from one of the board members not loyal to Thorne. "Meeting cancelled." Thorne withdrew the motion. "No one has the guts to question your judgment now." He had won. On all fronts. The cost, however, was immense. When the adrenaline began to subside, the pain in his chest returned with a vengeful force. He stumbled, and Elena steadied him, alarm replacing relief on her face. "Arthur." He looked at her, then at the small crowd of employees who had gathered, their faces no longer filled with fear, but with newfound respect. "I said I'd try to get better," he gasped, a small smile touching his lips. "I think now's a good time to start." With a final nod, he allowed himself to lean on her, the protector finally allowing himself to be cared for, while the world he saved watched in silence. 8 weeks after that dramatic confrontation in the lobby, the 40th floor of Vance Enterprises was unrecognizable. The white marble still gleamed, but now it was warmed by sunlight streaming through open blinds and the soft sound of occasional laughter. Where before a tense silence reigned, now there was a hum of energetic collaboration. Arthur's office, once a sanctuary of isolation, now had its door permanently open. The adjacent room, once a soulless storage room, had been transformed into a miniature wonderland. Walls painted with clouds and stars, a small slide in a corner, and a table covered in crayons and paper. It was Leah's domain. She was sitting on the soft rug, building a precarious tower of colorful blocks. humming the same Spanish lullaby her mother had sung to her. At the main desk, Arthur was seated, not in his imposing black leather chair, but in a simpler one next to Elena. She was no longer his assistant. She was his partner, the vice president of corporate social responsibility, an entirely new department he had created. Together, they reviewed plans for the Leah Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping mothers and children escape situations of domestic abuse, funded entirely by a significant portion of Arthur's personal fortune. He looked different, thinner, perhaps, but his eyes, once chips of ice, now held the warmth and depth of a summer sky. The heart transplant surgery had been a success. He had a new heart, literally and figuratively. The waiting list, which should have taken years, was miraculously shortened by an anonymous donation. Years later, he would discover that Peterson, in an act of loyalty and repentance, had used his life savings to make a substantial donation to the hospital in Arthur's name, speeding up the process. Peterson's, in turn, was promoted. He was now the head of a human resources department that genuinely cared about humans. Employees had on-site daycare, flexible hours, and a wellness program that became a model for other companies. Productivity and loyalty soared. It turned out that leading with compassion was far more profitable than leading with fear. Arthur's housekeeper, who for decades served in a fearful silence, was now a constant presence in the office, bringing snacks for Leah and treating Elena as the daughter she never had. She had become the official adoptive grandmother of that improbable family. Arthur looked at Leah's small block tower. "It's getting tall," he said, his voice filled with genuine pride. Leah looked at him, smiling. "Not as tall as your building," she replied with the logic of a 5-year-old, "but it's more colorful." Arthur chuckled, a genuine, warm sound that echoed through the office. "And you're right, little star. It's much more colorful." He looked at Elena, and their gazes met. No words were exchanged, but everything was communicated. Gratitude, respect, and a deep, quiet love that had grown from the ashes of their past lives. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had led them to a place of true happiness. The skyscraper that once symbolized power and isolation was now a beacon of hope and connection. The man who once measured his worth in billions now measured it in hugs, crayon drawings, and the sound of a child's laughter. He had learned the most important lesson of his life. True wealth wasn't in accumulating power to protect oneself from the world, but in using that power to protect others. True strength wasn't in the wall he had built around his heart, but in the courage to let it crumble at the touch of a small hand. He leaned back in his chair, the steady rhythm of his new heart, a gentle reminder of his second chance, and watched his family. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, bathing the scene in a golden light. Leah's block tower finally collapsed, and instead of crying, she laughed, immediately starting to rebuild it, stronger and brighter than before.